Madam President, we find ourselves in a situation in which every state in America is a border state. Now, it didn't used to be this way. And as one who has spent 2 years living along the U.S.-Mexico border, where I served as a missionary in my early 20s, I'm familiar with border towns, familiar with what they go through. And I can tell you from that experience where I lived and worked among the poorest of the poor along the border, among a lot of people who were recent immigrants themselves, some documented, others not documented. I can tell you that no one fears uncontrolled waves of illegal immigration more than people living along the border, including and especially those who are recent immigrants. It is, after all, their jobs, their neighborhoods, their children's schools, their communities that are placed at risk every time there's an uncontrolled wave of illegal immigration. Now, since I lived in border communities in the early 1990s in South Texas, things have gotten a lot worse, and they've gotten exponentially worse over the last 3 years. Things got so bad in the last month that we were setting all kinds of the wrong records. Day after day, we were exceeding the maximum number of daily migrant encounters our Border Patrol had ever observed in the history of our country. These are not the kinds of records that we want to break, nor are they the kinds of records that, when broken, are without consequence. Very real, very tangible consequences to the American people. Starting, of course, with those living in border communities, but extending through all 50 states, as all 50 states are seeing, feeling, experiencing, and paying the cost, the high cost of this wave of lawlessness. It is not a victimless crime. Just as the drug cartels are being enriched to the tune of many tens of billions of dollars a year, smuggling their human traffic across international boundaries, and just as the human traffic that they carry is bringing in enough fentanyl that it killed over 100,000 Americans last year, and enough fentanyl that if distributed to enough people would kill every American many times over. When that many people, we're talking somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 million people, maybe it's even more, enter a country unlawfully in such a short period of time, just 3 short years, there are all sorts of consequences to that, and among them happens to be the erosion of the rule of law. When that many people come into the country, and their first experience with this country, their very entry into this country's borders is itself an unlawful act, it doesn't bode well for the rule of law in America. It doesn't send a positive signal for what kind of country we're becoming. We've experienced that in every one of our states. We've seen crimes committed that should never have been committed because they were committed by people who should never have been in this country to begin with. And all this is before we even get to the question of who exactly is coming across our border. Our Border Patrol agents have observed all kinds of things in recent months and years, but especially in the last few months. People not just coming from Central America anymore, not just coming from Central and South America, but from all over the world, from all kinds of countries that you ordinarily wouldn't expect to be represented in large numbers crossing illegally across our southern border into the United States, countries like Afghanistan, like Syria, like China, and many, many others. We've seen many hundreds coming across who are on the terrorist watch list, known terrorists. We've seen a whole lot of others. Many hundreds, by some measures, thousands who have likely entered, who are from countries and otherwise entering under circumstances that are cause for alarm. And yet this is going on with the acquiescence, some would say with the blessing, of a presidential administration which appears to have ordained this very result. invited it, and effectively guaranteed it. This has been really good for the drug cartels, Madam President, who have been enriched to the tune of tens of billions of dollars every single year that Joe Biden has been in office, every year. But it's been really bad for the American people, especially America's poor and middle class, and anyone living on or near a border or in any community where people have been displaced, or where people have been ravaged by the effects of criminal activity carried out by those who should never have been in this country to begin with. The problem got so bad over the last few months that the state of Texas decided that it had to act. You see, Texas has a really long international border at the southern end of its state. And along that border, the state of Texas saw areas that were being traversed constantly, and yet perhaps not patrolled as well as they would have liked. And these were places where there were no adequate barriers, natural or otherwise, could keep people out, but that the state of Texas knew that could be protected if barriers could be placed there. So the state of Texas started putting up barriers along some of these stretches of border. And in particular, along a particular 27-mile stretch of border. The Biden administration, struggling to process these many thousands of illegal aliens crossing our border every single day, with all kinds of things to do to try to stop this, or at least act like they're trying to stop it, or at least process them, or whatever it is that they've been ordered to do that day. Apparently, this was too much for the Biden administration, because President Biden directed the Department of Homeland Security and the personnel along the border in Texas to go in and start taking down these barriers, putting up ladders across some of the barriers, cutting holes in other barriers, cutting concertina wire in other circumstances. So the state of Texas said, good heavens, that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right that we're besieged by these people who want to break our laws in order to enter our country. And the president is the chief executive officer of the federal government, and it is the federal government that's responsible for protecting us from invasion. Remember, an invasion can occur either by an organized, armed military force, or it can be a non-organized, non-uniformed, non-military force that's just entering another country en masse without authorization. That is the federal government's responsibility. It's one of the chief responsibilities, one of the most important responsibilities. But because the federal government wasn't carrying out that responsibility, and because the state of Texas saw a particular 27-mile stretch of border where Texas could make a difference by putting up some barriers, they put it there. But that was not okay with the Biden administration. They had to go take it down. Who knows how many additional illegal immigrants came in as a result of the personnel that had to be deployed to start taking down these barriers and cutting the wire. But they did it. Now, the state of Texas stepped back for a minute and said, it's really unfortunate that that's what the Biden administration wants to do with its scarce resources. It's really unfortunate that they want to make the state of Texas less safe, and with it the rest of the country. But it also doesn't really seem, constitutional. There are a couple of provisions of the Constitution that deal specifically with protecting the country against an invasion. One of them can be found in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, which says that when a state's being invaded, when it's under siege in some way, you should be able to appeal to the federal government for help in resisting that. Well, when Texas asked for help, it got quite the opposite. There's another provision, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. And that provision says, in essence, after telling the states that there are a bunch of things that they cannot do, states are not allowed to wage war, for example. States are not allowed to enter into an international compact, with a foreign country, and do certain things like that are akin to what the federal government is rather uniquely empowered to do. But there's an exception at the end, and it's an exception that applies when the state is being invaded. That states have the power to do that. So perhaps informed by these and other provisions of the Constitution, the state of Texas filed suit in U.S. District Court in Texas, trying to seek an injunction, that is, an order telling the Department of Homeland Security, look, you can't mess with Texas, you can't mess with Texas's barriers, don't take them down. After some initial back and forth litigation in the U.S. District Court, the matter went to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which includes the state of Texas. And on December 19th, 2023, just a little over a month ago, the Fifth Circuit issued an injunction, a preliminary injunction saying that while this litigation is pending, while we figure out once and for all whether, to what extent, and what circumstances the Biden administration may or may not choose to go in and take down these barriers put up by the state of Texas, Homeland Security and the Biden administration just can't do that. Don't do it for now. Doesn't mean don't do it forever. It just means don't do it for now while this litigation is pending, while the courts are ironing this out. Well, that remained in effect for just over a month. And then this last Monday, just a couple days ago, the Supreme Court of the United States issued a one-sentence order vacating that preliminary injunction. What does that mean? Well, that order doesn't do anything, doesn't tell the state of Texas it can't put barriers in place, doesn't tell the state of Texas it has to take it down, doesn't require any action on the part of the state of Texas. All it does is it gets rid of the order that previously was in place, telling the Department of Homeland Security and others within the Biden administration that they could not do anything to mess with the barriers put in place by Texas. Meanwhile, the case is set to be argued before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit on February 7th. So at that argument, the court will consider, the appellate court will consider the merits of the arguments and eventually make a ruling. I hope, I expect, I would imagine that in a case of this import and urgency, the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit will probably try to issue something within a few weeks. I would hope not much longer than that, maybe a month or two. And at that point, if the state of Texas prevails, then there will be a permanent injunction and order telling the Biden administration it can't take that down. Now, I'm sure whoever loses will take that to the Supreme Court. That will take some additional time. But the point is this. Through all this litigation, we've seen one consistent theme through all stages of the litigation. We've got the Biden administration going into court, making arguments like the following, pointing to provisions in Title VIII of the U.S. Code dealing with immigration issues, provisions guaranteeing that the Border Patrol must have access to areas 25 miles inland from the border so that they can do their work, so that they can enforce the border, so that they can do their jobs. This is one of the primary arguments they were making before the courts, is that this barbed wire or these barriers put in place by the state of Texas interfere with our ability as Border Patrol officers to access the land and to do our jobs. Well, what's their job? Well, to stop the illegal immigrants from coming across. So how exactly does this 27-mile stretch where these barriers have been put in place by the state of Texas, how exactly does that hinder the Border Patrol from doing the Border Patrol's job? Call me crazy, but I strongly suspect that if we could bring a handful of the Border Patrol agents up, they'd tell us that quite the opposite is true, that the placement of these particular barriers probably makes their job easier. But you know whose job this makes harder? It makes the job of the drug cartel, the human smuggler, the sex worker trafficker, remembering that a very substantial portion, estimates vary as to how many, but according to some, a majority of the women and girls trafficked through this network are subjected to sexual assault, many of them used as sex slaves, many of them forced to continue in that capacity even after they get into the United States, where they're working now as indentured servants. Yes, just a few weeks ago, I went to the border down in the McAllen sector, not too far from the area where I lived and worked for 2 years as a missionary back in the early 90s. And some Border Patrol officers there informed me that for the first time since the adoption of the 13th Amendment, which got rid of things like slavery and indentured servitude, we've actually got a sizable number of indentured servants in this country. People smuggled in who haven't been able to afford the $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, sometimes more, depending on what country they're from and how many risk factors there are. If they can't afford the passage from the cartels, they've got to work it off. So many of them remain as indentured servants. And for many of the girls and women in particular, they remain in sex slavery. So why exactly is the Biden administration so concerned with all of this happening, with a barrier that could make the job of the Border Patrol more effective, that could lead to the apprehension of more individuals? Knowing full well that by breaking up these barriers, all they're doing, the only people whose lives they're really making easier are the drug cartels, the people who are subjecting all these people to these horrible, deplorable conditions and bringing in enough fentanyl into the United States every year to kill every American multiple times. Why are they so concerned about that? And on what planet? On what planet can you maintain that it's making the job of the Border Patrol harder because you're making it harder for people to enter our country unlawfully? It really defies reason, wisdom, and logic. It is against this backdrop, Madam President, that we find ourselves today in a position in which we've got a war going on half a world away, a conflict involving Russia and Ukraine. It's a tragic conflict. You've got a bad guy, Vladimir Putin, who's messing with Ukraine yet again. Without getting into all the gory details, because this is not the focus of my speech today, of how that war started, why it's been dragging on so long, there is a renewed push to send more U.S. assistance to Ukraine, to send some additional aid to Israel, and the votes aren't there to get it passed through both houses of Congress. And so for that reason, they've married up the project of getting more money to Ukraine. You know, it's a $106 billion aid package. We still don't know exactly who would get how much. We still have yet to see bill text on any of that. But we're told that the majority of that money would go to Ukraine. About $12 billion of it would go to fund Ukraine's ongoing civilian government, to pay the salaries of its civil servants and its pensions, things like that. A lot of it involves direct military assistance. Overall, we expect about $62 billion or so of the $106 billion would go to Ukraine. The votes aren't there to get it. So some members of Congress, some members of the Senate, including both the Democratic leader and the Republican leader, have decided to try a somewhat innovative approach, combine the supplemental aid package with a border security package, marry them up, and then maybe you can get enough votes for both of it. I understand why they had come to the general conclusion. I understand that sometimes you've got to pair one thing up with another thing in order to build the consensus necessary to get either passed. It's a common technique used, and understand it, and it's understandable certainly why they'd want to use it here. But I believe there are some real problems with the manner in which we're going about that particular effort. Starting with the fact that it presupposes, on the border security front, that the reason for the current border surge, for the absolute humanitarian crisis unfolding along our southern border over the last 3 years and over the last few months in particular, is somehow the product of inadequate legislative authority on the part of the President of the United States and those answerable to him and charged with enforcing federal law. Madam President, it is not. It is not for want of adequate legislative authority in the executive officials charged with administering those laws. It's not for lack of any legislative authority on their part that we have this border security crisis. The exact same statutes were in place when Donald Trump was President of the United States. Donald Trump faced, as we all recall, some rather significant border surges as the cartels were pushing people increasingly into this country and making a lot of money smuggling them into the country. He utilized existing law to bring that crisis under control. Those same laws are in effect today. President Biden could, should, and would be able to fix this if only he had the will, the willingness to do it. In fact, if only he didn't have this defiant attitude that convinces him that he'd rather help the drug cartels and poor and middle-class Americans living in border communities and everywhere else in the United States. Shame on him for not using those. Now, the skeptic will immediately say, oh, yes, but that was Title 42 authority. Title 42 authority kicked in only because of the COVID pandemic in 2020. It's not really true. Look, he did use Title 42 authority, and that was pegged to the pandemic. But the crisis was mostly resolved. He was bringing it to a close by the time anyone had even heard the cursed word COVID or coronavirus in 2020. It was already well on its way to being a thing of the past, all without Title 42. Sure, Title 42 it didn't hurt, and it helped close the gap even further to the point where we effectively ended illegal border crossings in 2020, but we were well on our way in that direction. The biggest single step with that was not, in fact, Title 42. It was the Remain in Mexico program, also known as the Migrant Protection Protocol, an international agreement whereby the United States effectively entered into a safe third country agreement with Mexico. If you crossed into our southern border, into our country across our southern border by land, and thereafter claimed asylum, you were asked, where you were from, and you were returned back to Mexico because you were deemed eligible to apply for asylum in the first safe third country that you crossed into, or at least the country through which you were crossing before entering the United States. So they were returned to Mexico. Asylum applicants applying for asylum, appearing and crossing over land, were told that they would have to wait while their asylum application remained pending in Mexico. This worked like a dream. This dramatically reduced illegal border crossings. It took a significant amount of time by President Trump, by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, by various Department of Homeland Security officials, and a number of other members of the President's team in order to negotiate the terms of the Remain in Mexico program. And once in place, it worked like a charm. It worked really, really well. You see, because this is where a lot of this migrant surge phenomenon comes from. We have laws in place that offer asylum. Asylum is something that we offer to people who are wanting or needing to come to the United States because they've faced they've been targeted for some type of persecution based on their status. And, we're a nation of immigrants. We always have been. I hope we always will be a nation that welcomes immigrants. And we do. We welcome them a lot. We want them to come the legal way. Well, one of the ways in which we welcome immigrants is through our asylum laws. Now, you do have to satisfy certain statutory criteria in order to even be deemed eligible for asylum. Over the last few years, the vast majority of the people who cross our border without documentation and thereafter apply for asylum are ultimately deemed ineligible for it. I've heard numbers ranging from about 90% to 98 or 99%. I don't know where the actual numbers shake out. I think they vary from time to time. But we're talking about at least 9 out of 10, often more than that, who are not eligible. And so when you have people come in and apply for asylum, the way that it's supposed to work, they're supposed to be detained until such time as their asylum claims can be adjudicated by an immigration judge. They can be found either eligible or not eligible for asylum. If they are eligible, welcome to America. You're now a refugee. Come on in, and we welcome them. But if they're not, then they're supposed to be removed. Sent outside the United States, typically back to their country of origin. The problem has been that we've somehow gotten confused. We've gotten confused over the fact that we are, in fact, supposed to detain them until such time as their asylum application can be adjudicated. We've got it so confused that over the years, it's morphed into this monster that the drafters of the asylum laws who put it in place would scarcely recognize them. It's morphed into this weird thing where they come in, they say, I want asylum, and today they're told, okay, fill out the paperwork, tell us why you want asylum. Then they're told, okay, we're going to hold you for a few days. Then they're told, oh, our bed space is all full, so we can't detain you any longer. Then they're told not that they're going to be sent back to their own country, not that they're going to be sent back to Mexico as they would have been, as they were being under the Trump administration, under the migrant protection protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico. But here's a plane ticket. We'll fly you anywhere you want in the United States, on us. And unlike the measly American citizens, all of whom have to produce a driver's license in order to board a plane, you don't have to worry about that. We don't really know who you are, whether you say you are who you are, but yeah, go ahead. Here's the plane ticket. We'll make sure you get on that plane. We'll fly you anywhere you want. And as for your asylum application, don't worry about that. We just humbly, politely ask that at some point you're going to have an immigration hearing. We ask you to show up to it. And by the way, if you enter the United States without documentation right now and apply for asylum, and you get one of these plane tickets and they tell you, we hope you'll show up for your asylum hearing before the immigration judge someday, guess when that will occur? A week? No, longer. 6 weeks? Well, longer. 6 months? Longer. Now, it's in the mid-2030s. We're talking a decade or more away from today. So have fun. Enjoy the plane ticket on us. Go to wherever you want in the United States. And by the way, after 180 days, we'll even send you a work permit allowing you to work while you're here, even though you're without documentation. We'll fix that. We'll just make you documented, just because you've said you'd like to apply for asylum. This is insane. Of course we've had 10 million people come in to this country illegally. When we run it like that, who wouldn't want to come to America? It's the greatest country on earth. But the problem is, this is really dangerous. It's dangerous for those being human trafficked. It's dangerous for all the people in America who are being killed, 100,000 last year, killed by the fentanyl these guys are bringing across. It's dangerous for our communities. It's dangerous for people who lose their jobs because their jobs are being replaced by people who shouldn't be here to begin with. It's dangerous for those who are the victims of crimes that those people who shouldn't be here in the first place commit while they're here. Like 10 million people. Among 10 million people, you're going to have some bad ones. I'm sure you'll have a lot of good people, too, who are just trying to get by, just trying to make a living and not, be in a country where they feel they can't get ahead, but that it doesn't give them a right to be here. Our asylum laws sure don't. I'll tell you why. Because our asylum laws do not confer an individual right on anyone to asylum. No, this is a discretionary authority given to the Secretary of Homeland Security that he may grant asylum to those people who fit the criteria for asylum. He may. Remember, you're supposed to keep them locked up. You're supposed to detain them until such time as you can adjudicate the legitimacy of their asylum claims in an immigration hearing. And then you're supposed to deport them if they're not eligible and let them in only if they are. But instead, we run out of bed space, processing capacity. We say, forget it. Here you go. Come on in. We'll send you a work permit in 180 days. So, of course, we're going to have this problem. Then, somehow, that wasn't even enough by itself. I don't know exactly why, because the asylum track was working real well for the Biden administration to invite more and more drug cartel activity, enriching the drug cartels to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year. But maybe it wasn't quite enough for the big guy. Maybe he wanted more to come in. So what did he do? Well, he looked for other loopholes to exploit in our immigration laws. So he turned to the parole provisions. Now, parole, when we use it in the immigration context, is typically not talking about what you think about when somebody's out on parole from prison. This is an immigration parole. It involves a very specific type of relief that the president and those working under him in the area of Homeland Security may grant. Again, there's no right to parole any more than there is any right on the part of any individual to asylum. It's a discretionary grant of authority, but it's a narrow one. It's one that, pursuant to which the president or those answerable to him in the Homeland Security arena may allow someone in for two possible purposes, either for a discrete, distinct, individualized humanitarian need. The classic example of this, the long-time understanding of what that encompasses, it would involve someone outside the United States who doesn't have a visa to come into the United States, but whose grandmother is dying or has just died and he needs to attend the funeral. Parole authority can be granted for humanitarian purposes in that circumstance with the understanding that he'll leave in a few days after the funeral's over. Or maybe somebody outside the United States who doesn't have a visa here has a rare medical condition, treatment for which is available exclusively in the United States. He needs to come in for a few days to get that procedure, be treated with the understanding he'll leave soon after getting the treatment. The other prong of parole, immigration parole, exists in the public need, the public purpose arena, where, for example, someone speaks an obscure language, not typically spoken in the United States, and somebody is on trial in a court somewhere. They need an interpreter, someone who can speak that very rare language. They can't find one in the United States. They want to bring an interpreter in from another country who can speak that language so that the person can be afforded due process and a fair trial. That's the type of public need that can be filled with the parole authority loophole. But it's always been understood, it has always been the law, that parole is not to be granted en masse. It is to be granted on a case-by-case, individualized basis with individualized findings in all circumstances, nor is it supposed to be open-ended. Parole is not a visa. It's a temporary grant of permission to enter the country for a brief period of time with the understanding that when that need is over, in a finite period of time, the person will leave. So the Biden administration has now used parole. I believe last year alone, it was about 700,000 people, undocumented, were brought into the United States specifically using this parole authority. Now, these were not individualized determinations. These were not 700,000 individual people saying, I have a specific need, my grandma's dying, or I need a kidney transplant, or whatever it was. Or I speak this obscure language nobody else speaks, and I'm going to provide interpretation services in a court, and I need to get in so I can get out after doing the job. No, these were massive scale grants of authority, of permission to enter the United States under the parole authority. So, Madam President, it's against this backdrop that we have to get back to this supplemental aid package, the supplemental aid package that promises, okay, let's make lemonade out of lemons. We've got a lemon in that Ukraine aid can't pass by itself. So let's make lemonade out of it by getting those who want to make sure that we get lots of money to Ukraine, and let's pair that up with votes from people who really want to make sure the border is secure. It's really sad, if you think about it, that we're not all in that boat. I mean, look, people can reach different conclusions. Reasonable people can take a different conclusion as to whether, to what extent, in what way we're going to help Ukraine enforce Ukraine's border. That part's considered sort of optional in that it's not our border. Our border shouldn't be optional. That's not an extracurricular activity for us. That is the core of what we are supposed to be doing. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, and Article 4, Section 4 will make that clear, as will a number of other provisions of the Constitution and in federal statute. This is not optional. But getting back to that compromise. So the idea is to marry up those who really want border security. Unfortunately, it's not all of us, with those who want to make sure that we get money to Ukraine so that Ukraine's border can be protected. It's against that backdrop that I've just been describing that we're faced with that set of issues. And so we're told that what we're going to do is negotiate our way into passing new border security statutes, and those statutes will then end the border security crisis created willfully by the Biden administration's vehement, defiant refusal to enforce the law. Wait a minute, why would we expect them to enforce a new law when they're not enforcing the old law? I'm confused. Moreover, if we're going to negotiate this, doesn't that send the message to the rest of the country, the incorrect message, that if this project fails, that President Biden is somehow justified in not doing it because, oh, well, Congress didn't pass the law. I would have enforced the law, haven't enforced the border for years, the whole 3 years I've been President of the United States, so I guess I can't enforce it now. But I would have under new law, but I won't under existing law. Why should we take that seriously? And there are a lot of Americans who are looking at this, asking why we're willing to spend so much money on other countries and securing their borders, but not our own. How can we look those constituents in the eye? Knowing full well that, so far, according to the Heritage Foundation's estimates, this war, our support of this war, of Ukraine since this war started, the $113 billion that we provided, more than any other country on earth, by far, $113 billion of hard-earned American taxpayer dollars. That's real stuff. According to the Heritage Foundation, that amounts to about over $900 per American taxpayer on that conflict. Even at the height of the multiple wars that we were facing in 2008, where we were fighting wars not through a proxy, not just by providing military aid, but we ourselves were fighting wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and to a degree in Syria. Even that year, at the height of that conflict, the cost per taxpayer was somewhere in the range of, $700 or so. But just so far in the existence of this conflict, we've spent $113 billion already on Ukraine. And the American taxpayer is now being asked to spend another $62 billion on Ukraine when we still haven't secured our own border. And it's against that backdrop that we're saying, okay, then we'll negotiate into this new border security laws. Now, look, I would imagine there are a few of us who wouldn't vote for all kinds of things, wouldn't at least consider voting for all kinds of things if we were assured, if we really were certain, if we could see the future and predict with a high degree of certainty that if we voted for X, Y, or Z, whether it's Ukraine funding or something else, that the border would be secure and that it wouldn't be secure if we didn't vote for that thing. But I don't know how I can look my constituents in the face and tell them, yeah, we've got to spend this additional money here in order to get new laws so that President Biden can now enforce the border. When I know full well, and many of them know full well, that he could enforce the border now if he chose to do so. So I struggle with the premise of this at the outset, and I think it does send the wrong message. But the wrong message is only the beginning of my concern with this. The next step, we've got language that's been under negotiation, I believe, since October, November, December, and we're most of the way through the month of January. So we're like 4 months into this thing, into this negotiation. And yet we still have yet to see legislative text. It's a little frustrating. But what little we do know about it, what little we have been told, what little we've been allowed to see, I mean, I feel like a character in Oliver Twist, asking, please, sir, may I have some more, when I'm told just crumbs of details about what's in this legislation. What we do know is a little concerning. I'll be honest. So we've got the asylum problem, we've got the parole problem. As far as I can tell, there is no agreement at all. There's not even a hope of an agreement on the immigration parole issues, such that we would shut down the 700,000 or so people who were unlawfully brought in under parole authority in the last year alone. From my understanding, there is no agreement at all that would shut that down. And what discussions have occurred around parole deal with custodial parole issues involving some of these illegal immigrants, which is different than the immigration parole provisions that we're describing. So it doesn't deal with that. It does apparently tighten the asylum standards in ways that I'm told will be helpful, but in ways that I have yet to be able to evaluate because I haven't seen the text of the language. If it tightens the asylum standard, that might prove to be a nice thing to have. I don't dispute that. But is that what's going to make the difference between the utter defiant non-enforcement of our border and the laws that govern our border and the admissibility of individuals outside the United States who want to come into the United States? No, it doesn't. Because it remains the case today that asylum is a permissive grant of authority to the Secretary of Homeland Security and not a right on the part of any individual. And when the system's overwhelmed, the proper remedy should in fact be, you're not coming in, we're shutting this down. I, the Secretary of Homeland Security, am declining to grant or process any more asylum applications until we can get this under control, so it's shut down. And that leads me to another feature that we've been told just a little bit about as to the new proposal, that it creates a new authority whereby the President and the Homeland Security Secretary can just shut down the illegal crossings along the southern border once they can do it if they choose, once we've got 4,000 migrant crossing encounters per day, and they shall do it once we've got at least 5,000 migrant crossing encounters per day. That sounds intriguing. I really want to see this language. There are 1,000 different ways that could be written, and that too could be helpful. but there are things about it that also scare me to death. Things that, if they're written just a little bit wrong, could actually make matters worse. Let me explain. Let's suppose, for example, maybe, just maybe, this is written in such a way as to say, once we've reached 5,000 migrant encounters per day, that the requirement is perhaps, I don't know this, again, I'm having to speculate because they won't share the language with me or with anyone else, we will not process any more asylum applications once we have more than 5,000 migrant encounters per day. Let's suppose that that's what it says. If that's what it says, and that's a change compared to existing law, that would seem perhaps to change the assumption, and not just the assumption, but the reality that this is a permissive grant of authority. And once you say you may shut that down only after you've reached that level, then at that point, you've changed the may-shall nature of asylum. And the government's not required to stop processing them, if that's how it's written, until we've achieved that 5,000 migrant encounter per day number. By the way, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. A lot of people live in communities that are a fraction of that size. Cities or towns that are smaller than that. And when you multiply 5,000 people by 365 days, it comes up to 1.825 million people a year. That's a lot of people. Is this just resetting the norm? Saying that until that point, it's not really a problem? I don't know, because I can't see the text, but it certainly could mean that. And by the way, even once this authority kicks in, this authority to supposedly shut down the border, or in whatever capacity, whether through asylum, parole, or whatever other means they throw in there, they limit the number of days in which that can remain in effect. I believe the authority, as it was explained to me, would apply for up to 14 consecutive days. And what, then they have to reopen it, regardless of whether the number of migrant encounters has dipped meaningfully? I don't know. But it gets even worse than that. They set a maximum number of days in every year that the border can remain shut down under whatever weird construction they've adopted. Initially, I'm told it's 275 days per year. That's the end. At that point, let's suppose you've made it through 275 days total in a particular year of the border being, quote unquote, shut down, not being able to process more asylum applications or parole or exercise of parole authority or whatever it is. But on the 276th day, all the way through the end of day 365, it's immigration Mardi Gras. It's carnival ride. It's everybody on board the fun train. This is going to be great, and the cartels are going to make even more money. And they say, well, the cartels won't put up with that. Nonsense. The cartels are sophisticated enterprises that make tens of billions of dollars a year just on Joe Biden alone. You're telling me they're not going to calendar around this thing to make even more money? I've got a bridge to sell you if you think they're not. It gets even worse, Madam President, than that. You see, 275 days per year is only the limit in year one. From there, it ratchets down. By the second or third year, it ratchets down to a maximum of 180 days a year that the border can be deemed shut down under this new authority. Why in the Sam Hill would we agree to that? Why would we do that? Why would you want to limit less than half of the total number of days in a year, regardless of what's happening along the southern border, the time in which that border authority can be deemed shut down? I don't understand it. And it gets even worse than that, Madam President. With regard to parole authority, the number 180 appears apparently in this legislation not once but twice. Once, in the one that I just mentioned, maximum of 180 days that the border can be shut down under this new authority that apparently allows them to stop processing asylum applications, which they already have the power to do. but it appears a second time. You see, currently, there's a 180-day wait between the time an asylum application is processed and then given the plane ticket to the destination of their choice in the United States, on the plane that they can board without providing any documentation of their identity, not even a driver's license from their home country, just get on board. 180-day wait from the time that they board that plane until the moment they receive their work permit, which they really shouldn't have, because we shouldn't be processing them and letting them in unless or until such time as they've been deemed eligible for asylum and granted asylum, but whatever. They're at least given this 180-day mandatory wait period under current practice. They get rid of that in this proposal. No 180-day wait. You show up, and as long as you're not in one of those 180 days a year when it's going to be shut down, we'll get you processed, and we'll send you away from that detention facility before you board the plane with your work permit already in hand. This is nuts. Absolutely nuts. Now, look, I have great respect for my colleagues who are trying in good faith to work through this. I love my colleague, the senior senator from Oklahoma, Senator Lankford, one of my favorite people, not just in the Senate, one of my favorite people, period. I know he's doing the best job he can, and he's working under strict orders, not of his own choosing. I have deep respect for him. And that remains, despite any differences we may end up having on how we vote on this legislation. Nonetheless, I don't understand. I don't understand in part because they haven't been willing to share the text with me when I ask why we can't see the text. See, that's typically something we do because we make laws here. That's our job. We make laws. Laws consist of words. Words have meaning. We need to see the words well in advance of the time when we plan to pass them. But when I'm asked for legislative text on this one, I'm told, well, it's not all in one place. It's in lots of different documents. Well, that's fine. Look, for many years, as a lawyer, I was constantly dealing with documents that we were putting together that contained input for many, many lawyers, and I had to deal with 5, 10, 15 different documents at one time, try to synthesize them all. We can handle that. Everyone here can. Those who have practiced law or engaged in some other occupation have had training that allows us to read and understand things, and we've got smart people who work for us who can help us put it all together. But no, we still can't see it. So anyway, my point is I've got great respect for Senator Lankford and absolutely love the guy. But I've got deep concerns with what little I know about this, and this is all I have to go on. See, I hope he can understand my frustration with the process that tells me I can't see it, even though I know darn well the day is going to come when, if they get a deal, we may not have much time to review this thing. It happens from time to time. When the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, Johnson, and Jeffries, as it's currently comprised, spits out legislation when we're given hours or maybe a couple of days to read it, that's not cool. Happens all the time with spending legislation. It shouldn't. It's a barbaric practice. It's exactly why we're $34 trillion in debt. It should never happen when we're dealing with something as fundamental to our safety and security as this legislation. Put it in context, Madam President. The last time we undertook a major border security or immigration law overhaul, about a decade ago, we had that pending before the Senate Judiciary Committee in markup for an entire month. Judiciary Committee markup usually takes an hour or two, sometimes 3 or 4 for a really long one. This one took a month because this stuff is really complicated. And so it's staggering to me that they'd even consider rushing this through if and when they have a deal. Other things that concern me within what little we know about the legislation. I'm told that there will be 50,000 additional new immigrant visas granted in this provision. And then an additional number of people, some have estimated in the tens of thousands, others have estimated in the hundreds of thousands, of work permits that will be issued attached to other non-permanent visa holders or members of the non-permanent visa holders' family who are adults but not authorized to work. This would allow them to work. Some may have concerns with that. I remember over the years, one of the many things that I've tried to fix in the immigration system, it's long been my belief, you can fix our immigration code best if you target each particular issue as narrowly as possible. Don't lard everything up all in one bill, or else the thing's going to fail. I've tried for many years to end a discriminatory provision in our immigration laws that is strongly biased against people born in heavily populated countries, like India, for example. If you had two immigrants who were eligible for an immigrant visa, whether work-based or otherwise, but for the work-based immigrant visas, you had two people equally eligible for a visa. One was born in Luxembourg and the other one in India. The person born in Luxembourg, just by virtue of the fact that that immigrant came from a small country with a small population, might have that visa application processed and be in the United States in under a year. The person from India might be on a waiting list for 80 years, simply because of this discriminatory feature put in place, most likely for racist reasons many decades ago, to keep certain people that perhaps the race-minded lawmakers, the racist lawmakers at the time, might have considered undesirable. We've been trying to fix that for a long time. We finally passed something out of the Senate a couple of years ago that fixed this. It was a miracle. It took forever to get this done. I had been working on it for about a decade. Should have been a real layup pass to pass in the House, because there were 350 co-sponsors of the same legislation in the House, and they couldn't and wouldn't get it done. Anyway, I bring all that up to say that we moved heaven and earth to get that fixed without adding a single new visa, not a single new visa, to the visas allocated under existing law. Why? Well, because a lot of people were opposed to that. Now, I was falsely accused at the time by people who misinterpreted it as granting all kinds of new visas. It didn't grant a single new visa because we knew that would be very controversial. So to add 50,000 immigrant visas and perhaps tens to hundreds of thousands of additional work permits on top of that is not going to be non-controversial. You add to all of that the fundamental fact that Joe Biden could end this border security crisis right now. He could do it. First, stop taking down the barrier in Texas. You're embarrassing yourself and you're endangering our country. Don't do that. You know better. Shame on you, sir. Secondly, after he does that, he could and he should restore the Migrant Protection Protocol, the Remain in Mexico program. This was in place the day Joe Biden was sworn into office. Back in January 2021, he was doing great. President Trump handed over the cleanest border we've had in many decades to Joe Biden, and he messed it all up with a stroke of a pen. He backed out of the Remain in Mexico program. He canceled it. He was later ordered to reinstate it after some lengthy litigation, concluded that he acted unlawfully in getting rid of it. He continued to drag his feet. To this day, he hasn't done it. He could do it. He won't, but he should. And I ask him to reconsider today. But, Madam President, the fact that he's not doing this indicates that he and those who stand with him in this body are not acting in good faith. They're not negotiating in good faith. They must not be deemed to be good faith negotiators on this issue. Why? Because he refuses to enforce the laws that he has. And if for the sake of tightening some language here or there, in yet to be seen, yet to be understood ways, in ways that some have described as ambiguous and uncertain, if that's the primary thing we're getting is a tightening of the asylum standard, but we might also be limiting the ability of the current or future presidents to halt the abuse of asylum and parole, then we can't do this. We shouldn't be doing this at all, and it sends the wrong message. So, look, bottom line is this. I think we're back to the point where maybe we ought to just try to pass these separately. If you can get Ukraine supplemental aid passed, fine, go at it. If you can somehow come up with a deal that actually closes the border security gaps and actually forces the president's hands and places some accountability on him, then I'll consider that too. I may even vote for it if I think it fixes the job, notwithstanding the fact that I've got concerns about sending another $62 billion to a country where we've already spent $113 billion, $900 per U.S. taxpayer. But I'd consider it if it had actually fixed the problem. And I think there's probably ways to do it. I mean, one good way of starting would be to start as a starting point, take border security language already passed by the House of Representatives. I know people have said, well, that can't pass here. Well, we don't know that because we've never tried attaching that to other legislation like the Ukraine-Israel supplemental aid package, and then add to that border security metrics that would tie the expenditure of these $62 billion that are supposed to go to Ukraine, tie the release of those in phased packages over the next year, or whatever the increment is, to the achievement of certain border security metrics, goals. They can bring down to what they themselves have said is tolerable. I believe the Border Patrol has said that they max out when they get about 500 daily migrant encounters. If we could reduce it down to that, and the administration starts enforcing the law and actually starts refusing to let people in after they can no longer process them, and reinstates the migrant protection protocols, the Remain in Mexico program, that will help bring this down to less than 500 migrant encounters per day. And if you phase the release of the Ukraine funding under the legislation that way, then members of both parties could have some assurance that this might make a difference. But alas, there's no provision in this, no provision being negotiated. It's stunning to me that there isn't. There should be. The reason I say that is because we've had countless conversations within the Senate Republican Conference where member after member after member will propose something like that. My friend and colleague, the senior senator from North Dakota, John Hoeven, was one of the first to raise the idea and has been among the most impassioned advocates for it, saying let's tie the Ukraine funding to the achievement of certain border security metrics and other border security measures we might add to it. That'll give everybody the confidence that we need that this will make an actual difference. I believe he was the first one to suggest it and has probably made that argument as often as, or more often than any other member of the conference. But he's not alone. I think I've heard dozens of Republican senators say something similar. It's true, I've heard maybe one or two, three at the most, Republican senators express reservations with that. But many multiples of that speak out saying, yes, this would be a good thing. Yes, this could bring a lot of us on board. And yet, regrettably, my friend from Oklahoma was instructed not to even seek that. Why? Why do that? And if we can't even tie the expenditure of the Ukraine funds, which we know the administration cares about dearly for reasons I cannot comprehend. He cares so much more about Ukraine's border security than ours. I understand his desire to stop Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin's a bad guy. I wish he'd recognize, by the way, that there are things we could do with energy policy that might help in that direction. If the United States had been exporting this whole time large quantities of LNG, maybe that would help. Because Russia is funding this war and so many other things through its hegemony in the European energy market. There are all sorts of things that we could do that could help them, but he does remain concerned about this and wants to spend more and more money on military aid to Ukraine. But if he really cares as much as he does about Ukraine, and he wants to get that funding done, I strongly advise him to consider an option like what I've just described. Let us tie the release of the Ukraine funding. Let it be rolled out in staggered phases as the Biden administration achieves certain border security metrics and restores confidence, the confidence not just of members of the Senate and the House, but of the American people. I think that might work. Something like that, if it's packaged right and contains the right reforms, it might even get my vote. And I'm not somebody who's eager to vote for that, but I really want to secure the border because America is a less safe place. Every day, Joe Biden continues to enrich their drug cartels and subject women and children to sex slavery and indentured servitude. Madam President, we have a duty here to make sure that we pass good laws and to make sure that those laws are enforced as they're supposed to be. And when they don't enforce them, we shouldn't reward them by funding every pet project that the incumbent administration deems important. Sometimes we need to insist that they do their jobs. If we reward bad behavior, we're going to get more bad things, and it will be dangerous for the American people. I believe in this country. I believe in the American dream. That dream is becoming more distant every day. Lawlessness prevails. We can restore it, we can recapture it, but we do have to insist that our border be secure. It is not. May we make it secure once again, is my entire endeavor in giving these remarks tonight. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.